Before I begin, I truly hope you're all settled in, perhaps with a cup of tea, because this is a story that took me a lifetime to live and a good while to fully understand. My children, my own flesh and blood, decided I was already 1 foot in the grave, and they started fighting over my will, over the scraps they imagined I'd leave behind, long before I was gone. They had no idea I'd already made plans that would teach them a lesson they'd never forget. This is how I watched their greed consume them, and how I found my peace in the aftermath. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt underestimated, because that's where my story truly starts. The old house sighed around me, a familiar sound I'd grown accustomed to, especially in the quiet months since Robert, my dear husband, had passed. We'd built this life together, brick by brick, memory by memory. The scent of his pipe tobacco still clung faintly to the heavy curtains in the study, a comforting ghost that sometimes made the loneliness a little more bearable. We hadn't been extravagantly wealthy, not by any means, but we'd been prudent. Robert was an engineer, meticulous and careful, and I'd managed our home and, in later years, our modest investments with the same diligence. We'd wanted for nothing, and more importantly, we'd wanted our children, Michael and Sarah, to want for nothing essential either. We'd given them good educations, helped with down payments on their first homes, celebrated their successes, and cushioned their failures. Love, in our family, had always seemed like a verb, an action, a constant outpouring of support. Or so I had believed. I was Eleanor, a woman who had poured her soul into her family, believing that the well of familial affection was bottomless, that the investments of love would yield dividends of care and respect in my twilight years. I was beginning to understand, with a slow, dawning chill, how wrong I might have been. My children were adults now, with families and careers of their own, living lives that seemed increasingly distant from mine. Michael, my eldest, was a financial advisor, ironically enough, always with a sharp eye for an opportunity. Sarah, my daughter, was a part-time lecturer at a local college, married to a man, David, who always seemed to be looking over her shoulder and mine. Their visits had become less frequent after Robert's passing, and when they did come, the conversation often felt strained. There was an undercurrent I couldn't quite name, a subtle shift in their gaze when they looked at me, or rather at the things around me. The grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from Robert's parents. The collection of porcelain birds I'd gathered over 50 years. The house itself, solid and dependable, a testament to a life well lived. I started to notice their eyes lingering a little too long on these items, their questions about my plans becoming a little too pointed. "Are you managing okay here, Mum? All on your own?" Michael would ask, his tone smooth and solicitous, yet with an edge that pricked at my unease. "This is a big place for one person," Sarah would add, her gaze sweeping across the living room, as if already measuring it for new, invisible occupants. I'd assure them I was fine, perfectly capable. My mind was as sharp as ever, even if my joints sometimes creaked in protest at the morning chill. I still managed my own finances, paid my own bills, tended my small rose garden. But their concern, I was beginning to sense, wasn't entirely for my well-being. It was for the well-being of their potential inheritance. The thought, when it first truly formed, felt like a betrayal in itself, a cold sliver of ice in my heart. These were my children, the recipients of countless bedtime stories, scrape-knee kisses, and unwavering belief. Could they truly be so mercenary? I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself I was being overly sensitive, a lonely old woman imagining slights where none existed. But the feeling persisted, a stubborn weed in the garden of my affections. It was in the way Michael would casually ask about the value of Robert's old share portfolio, or how Sarah would inquire, just a little too brightly, if I'd had the antique silver appraised recently. Each question was a tiny pinprick, letting out a little more of the warmth I'd always associated with them. I remembered the sacrifices, not with bitterness, but with a growing sense of bewilderment. The promotions Robert had turned down because they would have meant uprooting the children from their schools and friends. The years I'd put my own aspirations on hold to ensure they had everything they needed, a stable home, a mother always present. We'd done it gladly, willingly, because that's what parents did. We hadn't kept a tally, hadn't expected repayment in kind. But respect? A little tenderness in my old age? That, I had perhaps naively assumed, was part of the unspoken contract of family. The house, which had always felt like a warm embrace, was slowly beginning to feel like a gilded cage, with my children peering in, not to see me, but to assess the value of the bars. My current vulnerability wasn't just about being widowed. It was about the dawning, terrifying realization that the people I loved most might see me not as their mother, but as a placeholder, a temporary guardian of assets they already considered their own. And this was just the beginning of their careful, creeping campaign. The turning point, the moment the vague unease sharpened into a definite, painful awareness, came on a crisp autumn afternoon. Michael and Sarah had arranged to visit together, something that was becoming increasingly rare and usually heralded a topic of importance. I'd baked Robert's favorite apple cake, its cinnamon scent filling the kitchen, hoping to evoke a sense of warmth, of shared history, of the love that surely still bound us. They arrived, Michael looking typically harried in his suit, Sarah with that perpetually worried frown she'd inherited from her father, though on her it looked more like disapproval. David, Sarah's husband, hovered in the background, a silent, appraising shadow. After the initial pleasantries, the stilted compliments on the cake they barely touched, Michael cleared his throat. "Mom," he began, his voice taking on that carefully modulated tone he used with clients he was trying to persuade. "Sarah and I have been talking, and we're a little concerned about you." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. "Concerned? About what, Michael?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Well, managing everything on your own. This big house, the finances, Dad always handled so much of that. This, of course, was patently untrue. While Robert had been the primary earner, I'd been the family accountant, the budgeter, the one who stretched every penny and made sure the investments grew. He always said I had a better head for figures than he did. But Michael, it seemed, preferred to remember a version of reality that suited his narrative, one where I was a slightly dottery old woman, incapable of managing her own affairs. Sarah chimed in, her voice softer but no less pointed. "We just think it might be time to simplify things. For your sake, of course. To make things easier for you as you get older." She glanced around the living room, her eyes lingering on the mahogany bureau where Robert and I kept important papers. "Have you thought about updating your will, Mum? It's been ages since you and Dad did that, hasn't it? And perhaps you could consider granting one of us power of attorney? Just so we can help you with bills and things if you ever need it. It would give us peace of mind." The words hung in the air, heavy and cloying. Power of attorney. Updating the will. It was all so neatly packaged, gift-wrapped in their supposed concern. But I saw through the pretty paper to the cold, hard calculation beneath. They weren't worried about me struggling. They were worried about me spending what they considered their money, or worse, leaving it to someone else, or even, heaven forbid, spending it all on myself in my final years. I thought of all the times I'd put their needs before my own. The trip to Italy Robert and I had dreamed of for our 25th anniversary, postponed indefinitely because Michael needed help with a deposit for his first apartment. The art classes I'd longed to take, sacrificed because Sarah's university fees were higher than anticipated. I recalled the endless school runs, the sleepless nights nursing them through illnesses, the unwavering support for their every ambition, no matter how fleeting. I remembered Sarah, as a teenager, tearfully confessing she'd crashed her first car, a minor fender bender, but she was terrified of her father's reaction. I'd taken the blame, said I'd misjudged a parking space. Robert had grumbled, but forgiven me. Sarah had hugged me, promising she'd never forget it. Now, sitting there, faced with her cool, appraising gaze, I wondered if she remembered any of it at all. "Your father and I reviewed our wills not 5 years ago, Sarah," I said calmly, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside. "And I am perfectly capable of managing my own finances, Michael." As I always have, Michael exchanged a quick, frustrated glance with Sarah. David shifted his weight, a subtle sound of impatience. "Of course, Mum, of course. Michael said a little too quickly. We know you're capable. It's just planning for the future. Contingencies. We only want what's best for you. And what, in your estimation, is best for me? I asked, a dangerous quietness entering my tone. Sarah rushed to speak. Well, perhaps a smaller place? Something easier to manage? This house holds so many memories, of course, but it's a lot of upkeep. And if you sold it, you'd have a nice nest egg. To ensure you're comfortable, a nest egg. My home, reduced to a financial instrument. The place where they'd taken their first steps, where Robert and I had danced in the kitchen, where generations of family Christmases had unfolded, was now just an asset to be liquidated. The apple cake sat between us, its sweet scent now a mockery. The seed of doubt, planted by their earlier, subtler inquiries, had not just sprouted, it had unfurled its first, ugly leaves. They weren't just interested in my assets, they were actively strategizing how to get their hands on them, cloaking their greed in the guise of loving concern. The betrayal was no longer a sliver of ice, it was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. And as they continued to press their case, their arguments becoming more insistent, their concern more transparently self-serving, I felt a profound sadness settle over me. This was not the family I had poured my life into. These were not the children I had raised. Or perhaps they were, and I had simply been too blind, too wrapped up in the rosy glow of maternal love, to see the grasping nature that lay beneath. The true extent of their machinations, however, was revealed a few weeks later, quite by accident. I had a doctor's appointment, one I told them about, and Sarah had offered to drive me. It was a gesture that, even in my growing disillusionment, I'd found a small measure of comfort in. Perhaps, I'd thought, there was still a flicker of genuine care. The appointment ran late, and as we walked back to the car, Sarah's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID. "Oh, it's Michael," she said, a slight frown creasing her brow. "Probably wondering where we are," she answered, putting it on speakerphone, a habit she had that I usually found irritating, but on this occasion it proved to be illuminating. "Hey, are you guys done yet?" Michael's voice, typically brisk, came through the speaker. "Yes, just heading back now," Sarah replied. "Did Dr. Henderson say anything, significant?" Michael asked, and there was an odd inflection in his voice, a kind of strained casualness that immediately put me on alert. "No, just the usual. Blood pressure's fine, a bit of arthritis in her hands, but she's generally healthy for her age." "Why?" There was a pause, and then Michael said, his voice dropping slightly, "Well, I was just thinking. If she's going to be around for another 10-15 years, that changes the timeline a bit, doesn't it? Regarding the house, and, well, everything." My breath caught in my throat. I felt Sarah stiffen beside me. She quickly fumbled for the phone, trying to take it off speaker, but it was too late. I'd heard enough. "Michael, I can't really talk right now," Sarah said, her voice suddenly flustered. "I'll call you later." She ended the call, her face flushed. She wouldn't meet my eyes. We walked the rest of the way to the car in a silence so thick I could have cut it with a knife. A timeline. They had a timeline for my demise, a schedule for their inheritance. My continued existence was an inconvenience, a delay in their financial planning. The casual cruelty of it, the cold, pragmatic discussion of my remaining years as if I were a depreciating asset, struck me with the force of a physical blow. I felt a wave of nausea, a profound, sickening sense of being utterly and completely alone. Once we were in the car, the silence stretched, punctuated only by the hum of the engine. Sarah drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Finally, I spoke, my voice barely a whisper. "So, you and Michael have been discussing my timeline?" Sarah flinched. "Mom, it's not what you think, isn't it?" I asked, my voice gaining a little strength, fueled by a sudden surge of cold anger. "It sounded very much like you were discussing how long I might inconvenience you by staying alive." "No, that's not fair," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "We were just concerned. If you were to get really ill, the costs we need to be prepared to take over, you mean?" I said flatly. "Prepared to divide up my belongings." I suppose you've already decided who gets the grandfather clock and who gets my porcelain birds." Sarah didn't answer, her silence a damning admission. The rest of the drive home was a blur of pain and disbelief. I felt like a ghost in my own life, already assessed, valued, and mentally distributed. The house, when we pulled into the driveway, no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a stage upon which a sordid family drama was playing out, with me as the unwitting and unwilling central prop. Later that evening, unable to settle, I found myself wandering through the rooms, my hand trailing over familiar objects. Robert's armchair, still holding the faint imprint of his form. The photographs on the mantelpiece, Michael and Sarah as smiling, gap-toothed children, their faces alight with an innocence that now seemed like a cruel joke. How had those children become these grasping, calculating adults? Had I done something wrong? Had Robert and I, in our desire to give them everything, somehow fostered this sense of entitlement, this profound lack of empathy? I remembered Robert, his gentle nature, his unwavering belief in the good in people, especially his children. He'd always made excuses for their little selfishnesses, their occasional lapses in consideration. "They're young, Eleanor," he'd say. "They'll learn," but they hadn't learned. Or rather, they'd learned a different lesson entirely, that their wants superseded everything, even, it seemed, their mother's dignity and peace of mind. The sheer audacity of their planning, the casual way they discussed my future, or lack thereof, as if I were already a footnote in my own story, was staggering. It wasn't just about the money, I realized. It was about respect. Or rather, the utter lack of it. They didn't see me as their mother anymore, not truly. They saw me as an impediment, a kindly old jailer guarding their treasure. The initial pain was a raw, gaping wound. But beneath the pain, something else was beginning to stir, a cold, hard anger and a burgeoning resolve. They might see me as old and frail, a relic of a bygone era. They might think I was oblivious, easily manipulated. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The last straw, as they say, wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a single, explosive event. It was a slow accumulation of slights, a steady drip of disrespect that finally wore away the last vestiges of my maternal patience. It was Michael calling, ostensibly to check on me, but then spending 20 minutes talking about a hypothetical investment scenario that sounded suspiciously like liquidating a deceased parent's estate. It was Sarah visiting, ostensibly for tea, but then casually leaving a brochure for a luxury assisted living facility on the coffee table, one that looked more like a beautifully appointed waiting room for the afterlife. "Just something to consider, Mum," she'd said brightly. "They have excellent care, and it would take so much worry off our minds, my worry or theirs." I'd wondered, placing the glossy pamphlet directly into the recycling bin as soon as she'd left. The most galling incident, perhaps, was when David, Sarah's husband, who rarely spoke directly to me about anything significant, cornered me in the kitchen during a rare family Sunday lunch I'd insisted on hosting, hoping to recapture some semblance of familial warmth. He'd leaned against the counter, arms crossed, a smug little smile on his face. "Eleanor," he'd said, his tone overly familiar, "Sarah and Michael are really just trying to look out for your best interests, you know. This house, it's a gold mine. But property taxes are only going up. Maintenance is a killer. You could be sitting on a beach somewhere not worrying about a thing if you just let them help you manage things." The implication was clear. My comfort was secondary to their financial gain. My home, the repository of my life with Robert, was merely a gold mine to be exploited. The sheer, unadulterated greed in his eyes, the dismissive wave of his hand as he spoke of maintenance, as if the love and care Robert and I had poured into this house were mere trivialities, ignited something in me. It wasn't a fiery rage, it was a cold, clear certainty. My heartbreak, which had been a dull ache for weeks, began to solidify into a steely resolve. They saw me as a doddering old fool, easily parted from her assets. They saw me as a character in their pre-written play, a passive figure awaiting her exit cue. They had no idea who I truly was, the strength I possessed, the lessons Robert and I had learned about prudence and planning. I realized then that they didn't just want my money. They wanted to erase my autonomy, to control my narrative, to manage me out of my own life. And I would not allow it. I would not let their avarice tarnish the legacy Robert and I had built, a legacy intended for good, not for squabbling. The thought came to me then, not as an act of revenge, though I confess a certain grim satisfaction flickered within me, but as an act of profound, personal justice. If they were so obsessed with my estate, so eager to see it divided, then I would ensure it was divided in a way they could never have anticipated. I would ensure it went where it would be appreciated, where it would do genuine good, where it would honor the values Robert and I had cherished. The idea of donating the bulk of our estate to charity began to take root, not as a punitive measure, but as a creative, empowering act. It was a way to reclaim my agency, to write my own final chapter, and to ensure that our life's work would contribute to something meaningful, something larger than their petty squabbles. That evening, after David's odious little speech, I sat in Robert's study, the scent of his pipe tobacco a comforting presence. I looked at his photograph on the desk, his kind eyes smiling out at me. "They've forgotten who we are, Robert," I whispered to the quiet room. "They've forgotten what we stood for." And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. The sadness was still there, a deep well of sorrow for the children I thought I had, for the family I believed we were. But now, it was overlaid with a new emotion, determination. I wasn't going to fight them on their terms, to engage in their sordid little games of manipulation and guilt. I was going to rise above it. I was going to take control. The next morning, I made my first call. Not to Michael, not to Sarah, but to an old friend, Margaret, whose late husband had been a solicitor. I needed advice, a starting point. And as I explained my situation, carefully, calmly, I felt a strength I hadn't realized I possessed. The turning point had been reached. Eleanor, the grieving widow, the supposedly frail old mother, was about to become Eleanor, the architect of her own destiny. And my children, so busy counting their chickens before they'd hatched, were in for a very big surprise. The resolve that settled in me was a quiet, deep river, not a raging torrent. It was the kind of resolve that comes after deep sorrow, when the tears have dried and what remains is a clear, unwavering purpose. My first step was to seek out proper legal counsel, someone discreet, experienced, and most importantly, entirely unconnected to Michael or any of his financial world associates. Margaret, my dear old friend, after listening patiently to my tale of woe, her indignation growing with every word, recommended a solicitor named Ms. Evelyn Albright. "She's sharp as a tack, Eleanor," Margaret had said, "and she has a reputation for handling sensitive estate matters with utmost professionalism. And believe me, dear, your situation requires a delicate but firm hand." I made an appointment with Ms. Albright the very next day. Her office was in a quiet, unassuming building downtown, a far cry from the flashy glass and steel towers Michael frequented. Ms. Albright herself was a woman in her late 50s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through any pretense and a calm, reassuring demeanor. I found myself pouring out the whole sorry story, the gradual dawning of my children's intentions, the overheard conversations, David's blatant pitch in my kitchen. I even confessed my own feelings of guilt and failure. Had I somehow caused this? Ms. Albright listened without interruption, her expression empathetic, but maintaining a professional composure. When I finally finished, her voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Sterling," she began, using my married name, which somehow felt like a shield of respect, "what you are experiencing, sadly, is not as uncommon as you might think. And let me assure you, their choices are their own, not a reflection on your parenting. You have every right to decide the disposition of your assets as you see fit, and to live your life with dignity and autonomy." Her words were like a balm to my bruised spirit. She didn't judge my desire to redirect my estate. Instead, she saw it as an assertion of my will, in every sense of the word. Over the next few weeks, Ms. Albright and I worked meticulously. We went over every detail of the assets Robert and I had accumulated. The house, of course, which was fully paid off and had appreciated considerably over the decades, our investment portfolio, which I had managed to grow steadily even after Robert's passing, the savings accounts, even the collections of antiques and art, some of which, like Robert's prized stamp collection, had significant monetary as well as sentimental value. The first thing, Ms. Albright advised, is to ensure you are comfortably provided for the rest of your natural life. We need to set aside a sum that guarantees your independence and covers any potential future needs, including healthcare. This was paramount to me. My plan wasn't about self-negation. It was about ensuring my legacy was one of generosity, not about leaving myself destitute. We calculated a generous figure, enough for me to live comfortably, travel a little if I wished, and never have to ask my children for a penny, a prospect that now filled me with dread. Once my own future was secured, we turned to the remaining, considerable portion of the estate. This was the part that brought a quiet joy to the otherwise somber process. I thought long and hard about the causes Robert and I had cared about. He had always been passionate about education, believing it was the key to unlocking potential. He'd often volunteered as a tutor for underprivileged children. I, on the other hand, had a deep love for animals and a concern for the environment, a legacy from my own upbringing on a small farm. We also both felt strongly about medical research, particularly after witnessing friends and family battle various illnesses. Ms. Albright helped me identify several reputable charities, a scholarship fund for disadvantaged students, a well-regarded animal sanctuary that desperately needed funding for a new veterinary wing, and a leading research institute working on degenerative diseases. We drew up the new will, a precise and irrevocable document. We also explored the possibility of establishing a charitable trust to manage the donations over time. The legal paperwork was complex, but Ms. Albright explained every clause, every implication, ensuring I understood exactly what I was signing. There was a profound sense of empowerment in those meetings, in the quiet scratch of my pen on official documents. I was taking back control not just of my assets, but of my narrative. My children thought they were writing my final chapter, but they were merely scribbling in the margins of a story whose ending I alone would determine. During this period, I had to be careful. I continued my usual routines, spoke to Michael and Sarah when they called, endured their not-so-subtle inquiries about whether I'd thought any more about simplifying things. I learned to offer vague, non-committal answers. "Oh, I'm looking into various options," I'd say, or "I'm getting some advice on how best to manage things." They, of course, interpreted these statements through the lens of their own desires, assuming I was finally coming around to their way of thinking, preparing to sign everything over to them or at least structure my will to their liking. Their concern actually intensified, accompanied by a new layer of solicitousness that was almost comical in its transparency. Sarah started bringing me little gifts, a new brand of tea she thought I might like, a book she'd just happened to pick up. Michael called more frequently, his voice smoother than ever, offering to help me sort through paperwork or explain any confusing financial jargon. Little did they know, the jargon I was dealing with under Ms. Albright's expert guidance was far from confusing to me. It was the language of liberation. The process of finalizing the donations and restructuring my will took several months. During this time, I became quite adept at playing a part. The slightly frail, somewhat indecisive elderly mother my children seemed to believe I was. It was a strange charade. On the one hand, it saddened me that they couldn't see, or perhaps didn't want to see, the woman I truly was. On the other, their underestimation became my greatest ally. They were so convinced of their own cleverness, so certain of my impending capitulation, that they failed to notice the quiet strength in my eyes, the new firmness in my voice when I chose to use it. I continued my weekly bridge games with Margaret and our little circle, finding solace and a sense of normalcy in their company. Margaret, of course, was privy to my plans, and her quiet support was a bedrock. "You're doing the right thing, Eleanor," she'd affirm, squeezing my hand during a particularly tense dummy hand, though I knew she was referring to more than just the cards. "Robert would be proud of you." Her words meant more than she knew. The thought of Robert's approval, his imagined smile, kept me steady on days when the weight of my children's betrayal felt particularly heavy. Michael and Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to be growing increasingly impatient, though they tried to mask it. Their calls became more frequent, their suggestions more direct. "Mum, have you had a chance to speak to that solicitor yet?" Michael would ask, trying to sound casual. "The one we recommended? He's very good with estate planning." I had, of course, ignored their recommendation, knowing any solicitor they suggested would likely have their interests, not mine, at heart. "I'm considering all my options, dear." I'd reply vaguely, a phrase that seemed to satisfy and frustrate them in equal measure. Sarah, during one visit, brought a stack of glossy brochures for various retirement communities. "I just thought you might like to see what's out there, Mum," she said, spreading them on the coffee table like a croupier dealing cards. "Some of them are lovely, like permanent holidays. And it would be so much less for you to worry about." I glanced at the pictures of smiling, silver-haired seniors engaged in sedate activities. It looked like a beautifully furnished waiting room for the inevitable. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, my voice neutral. "I'll certainly look at them." As soon as she left, they joined the assisted living brochure in the recycling bin. My internal monologue during this period was a curious mix of sorrow, wry amusement, and a growing sense of quiet power. I observed their machinations almost as an outsider, noting the irony of their feigned concern, the pathetic transparency of their greed. They were so busy planning how to spend my money, they never once considered that I might have plans of my own. It was as if my own agency, my own desires, had ceased to exist for them. I was merely a conduit for their inheritance. The day I signed the final documents with Ms. Albright was a significant one. The sky outside her office window was a clear, determined blue. As my pen moved across the pages, transferring the bulk of Robert's and my life's work to the chosen charities, ensuring my own comfortable future separately, a profound sense of peace settled over me. It wasn't the giddy triumph of revenge. It was something deeper, more satisfying. It was the quiet assurance of justice done, of a legacy preserved according to its true intent. Ms. Albright smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Sterling," she said. "You've done a remarkable thing." Walking out of her office building, I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of my children's expectations, their unspoken demands, had been lifted. I was no longer just Eleanor, the grieving widow, the target of their avarice. I was Eleanor, the benefactor, the woman who had taken control of her own story. The waiting game continued for a little longer. I needed the legal arrangements to be fully in place, irrevocable, before the inevitable confrontation. I let Michael and Sarah believe they were making progress, that their carefully constructed campaign of concern was working. It was a necessary deception, and one, I felt, they had more than earned. The true test, I knew, would come when they finally decided to force the issue, to demand a clear accounting of my intentions. And I had a feeling that day was not far off. Their patience, unlike mine, was clearly wearing thin. The family meeting, as Michael rather portentously called it, was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. He'd phoned earlier in the week, his tone brisk and businesslike. "Mum, Sarah and I would like to come over on Saturday. There are a few things we need to discuss properly. About your future and, well, to make sure everything's in order." The implication was clear. They believed in order meant in their order. I agreed, my voice calm. "That would be fine, Michael. Around 2. Inside, my heart beat a little faster, but it was the anticipation of resolution, not fear. The day arrived, gray and overcast, mirroring the mood I knew was about to descend upon my living room. I'd prepared tea and some simple biscuits, a gesture of normalcy in what I anticipated would be anything but a normal afternoon. They arrived together, Sarah looking anxious, Michael with an air of strained patience, as if he were about to close a particularly difficult business deal. David, Sarah's husband, was with them, a silent, looming presence I'd come to expect and resent. "Mum," Michael began, after the briefest of pleasantries, forgoing the tea I offered. He sat forward on the edge of Robert's armchair, a position of assumed authority that irked me. "We need to be frank. We're worried about you, and we're worried about your estate. We think it's time you made some concrete decisions." Sarah nodded in agreement, her gaze darting around the room as if reevaluating the worth of each item. "We've been looking into some lovely places for you, Mum," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Secure, comfortable, where you wouldn't have to worry about a thing." And Michael continued, "We really need to talk about the will. Have you had it updated? We need to know what your intentions are." For planning purposes, of course, he gave a tight, insincere smile. "It's important for us to be able to manage things smoothly when the time comes. There was again that chilling euphemism for my death. I let them talk, watching them, listening to the carefully rehearsed arguments, the feigned concern that barely masked the raw avarice beneath. They spoke of protecting my assets, of ensuring my legacy was preserved, by which they clearly meant preserved for them. David even chimed in, suggesting that if I were to sell the house and give them an early inheritance, it would simplify things enormously and allow them to invest it wisely on my behalf. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. They had already spent my money in their minds, allocated my belongings, arranged my decline. I was merely an obstacle, a temporary inconvenience in their path to enrichment. I listened patiently, my expression carefully neutral, though inside, a storm of emotions raged. Sadness, yes, for the children I had lost, or perhaps never truly had, but also a growing sense of righteous anger and a steely determination to see this through. They spoke for nearly an hour, outlining their suggestions, which sounded more like demands. They proposed selling the house and moving me into one of the lovely facilities Sarah had researched. They suggested consolidating all my accounts under Michael's management. They repeatedly pressed for details about my will, asking if I'd made them joint executors, if I'd been fair in the division of assets. The phrase being fair was particularly galling, given their current behavior. Finally, when they seemed to have exhausted their arguments, when a silence fell, thick with their unspoken expectations, Michael leaned back, a look of satisfaction on his face, as if the matter were settled. "So, Mum," he said, his voice softer now, as if coaxing a child. "What do you say? Are you ready to let us help you get things in order?" I took a slow sip of my now lukewarm tea. I looked from Michael's expectant face to Sarah's anxious one, to David's smugly confident smirk. And then I smiled, a small, quiet smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. It was time. "Well, children," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, even calm. "I appreciate your concern." I paused, letting the word hang in the air, freighted with all its unspoken irony. "And you'll be pleased to know that yes, my affairs are indeed in order. My will is settled, everything meticulously arranged." A collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through them. Michael's smile widened, genuinely this time, or so it appeared. Sarah visibly relaxed, a little color returning to her cheeks. David actually rubbed his hands together, a gesture of gleeful anticipation he quickly tried to suppress. "That's wonderful news, Mum," Michael exclaimed. "We knew you'd see sense. So, perhaps you could let us have a copy? For our records? Just so we understand your wishes." "Oh, I don't think a copy will be necessary for you," I said softly. "But I can certainly tell you about my wishes." I reached for a simple, cream-colored envelope that lay on the side table beside me. It wasn't the will itself, that was safely lodged with Ms. Albright, but a summary I had prepared, along with a letter from my solicitor. "You see," I continued, my voice gaining a quiet strength, "Robert and I always believed that the wealth we accumulated, modest as it is, should be used for good. We worked hard, we saved, we invested, not just for ourselves or even for you, but with a broader sense of responsibility." Michael's smile faltered slightly. Sarah frowned, a flicker of unease in her eyes. "What do you mean, Mum?" she asked, her voice suddenly wary. "I mean," I said, looking directly at them one by one, "that after ensuring I have more than enough to live comfortably and independently for the rest of my days, with no need to rely on anyone, the vast majority of my estate, this house, the investments, the collections you've all shown such interest in, has been irrevocably bequeathed to a number of charitable organizations." The silence that followed was profound. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Michael's face, which had been alight with anticipated triumph, slowly turned a mottled shade of red, then pale. Sarah's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with disbelief. David looked as if he'd been slapped. Charities? Michael finally choked out, his voice a strangled whisper. What charities? What are you talking about? Several, actually, I replied calmly. There's a scholarship fund for underprivileged students, in your father's name. He always valued education so highly. Then there's the Willow Creek Animal Sanctuary. They do wonderful work, and they're building a new veterinary clinic. And finally, a significant portion will go to the Institute for Neurological Research to support their work on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Robert would have approved. I pushed the envelope across the coffee table towards him. This is a letter from my solicitor, Ms. Evelyn Albright, confirming the arrangements and a brief summary of the bequests. It's all quite legal and binding. Michael stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't reach for it. You can't do this, he stammered, his voice rising. This is our inheritance. Our birthright. Your birthright? I echoed, my voice tinged with a sadness that surprised even myself. Was it your birthright to plot and scheme behind my back? To discuss my timeline as if I were an expiring commodity? To treat your mother with such profound disrespect and greed? Sarah finally found her voice, a high-pitched wail of betrayal. How could you, Mother? After everything Dad wanted for us. Your father wanted you to be good, decent people, Sarah, I said, my gaze unwavering. He wanted you to be happy and secure, yes, but not at the expense of your character. He would be appalled by your behavior these past few months. Appalled and heartbroken. This is madness. Michael shouted, finally snatching up the envelope and tearing it open. His eyes scanned the letter from Ms. Albright, his face contorting with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She's taken you for a ride, Mum. Some shyster lawyer. We'll contest this. You're clearly not of sound mind. I met his furious gaze with a calm I hadn't known I possessed. Oh, I assure you, Michael, my mind is perfectly sound. Ms. Albright is a highly respected solicitor, and every detail has been meticulously attended to. The donations are legally ironclad. And as for my mental state, I've never felt clearer in my life. I leaned back in my chair, a sense of profound, if somber, vindication washing over me. You see, children, you were so busy fighting over the spoils, so convinced of your entitlement, that you never once stopped to consider me, your mother, as a person with her own wishes, her own will. You saw only an obstacle to your desires. You wanted my legacy? Well, this is my legacy. Generosity, not greed. Support for those who truly need it, not fuel for your endless wanting. David, who had been silent up to this point, finally exploded. This is an outrage. An absolute outrage. We've been cheated. Cheated? I raised an eyebrow. Were you ever promised anything, David? Did Robert or I ever sign a contract stating you were entitled to our life savings simply by virtue of your marriage to our daughter? The room throbbed with their impotent fury. The carefully constructed facade of filial concern had shattered, revealing the ugly, grasping reality beneath. And in that moment, watching their shock, their disbelief, their dawning horror, I felt not triumph, but a profound sense of release. The game was over, and I had, in my own quiet way, won. The immediate aftermath of my announcement was chaotic, a maelstrom of disbelief, anger, and frantic accusations. Michael, his face flushed a deep crimson, paced the living room like a caged animal. This isn't over, Mother, he snarled, waving Ms. Albright's letter. There are lawyers who specialize in this kind of thing. Undue influence, diminished capacity. We'll fight this. I swear we will. His threat, however, rang hollow. He, a financial advisor, knew the strength of a well-prepared legal document, and Ms. Albright had left no loopholes. You are welcome to try, Michael, I said, my voice remaining surprisingly calm amidst his tirade. But Ms. Albright is exceptionally thorough, and I have undergone a full competency assessment at her recommendation with a highly respected geriatric psychiatrist. The report is, I believe, quite unequivocal about my soundness of mind, This seemed to take some of the wind out of his sails. He stopped pacing and stared at me, his eyes narrowed. The idea that I had preempted his every move, anticipated his every objection, clearly infuriated him. Sarah, meanwhile, had dissolved into tears, though they seemed more tears of frustration and thwarted desire than genuine sorrow. "But why, Mum?" she sobbed, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "Why would you do this to us? Don't you love us?" That question, after everything, struck me as profoundly ironic. "Love you," I repeated softly. "Of course, I love the children I raised, the memories of who you were. But love, Sarah, is not a blank check for disrespectful and avaricious behavior. Love does not mean I must reward your greed. Your father and I worked our entire lives, not so you could squabble over our assets like vultures, but so we could live with dignity and perhaps leave a legacy of kindness. It seems that kindness will now be directed to those who will truly appreciate it and who will use it for good." David, ever the pragmatist, was already calculating the financial implications. "So, what exactly is left?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "You said you kept enough for yourself. How much? Is the house even part of these donations immediately or after?" He trailed off, realizing the indelicacy of his question, though clearly not caring. "The house, my dear David," I said, a touch of steel in my voice, "is part of a charitable remainder trust. I will live here comfortably for the rest of my days. Upon my passing, it will transfer to the designated charities. As for my personal finances, they are more than adequate for my needs, and frankly, they are no longer any of your concern." Their faces were a study in outrage and impotence. The carefully laid plans, the months of concern and manipulation, had all come to nothing. They had counted their chickens not only before they hatched but before the eggs were even laid in their basket. Michael made a few more blustering threats about legal action, about exposing Ms. Albright, but his fury was ebbing, replaced by a sullen, bitter resentment. Sarah continued to weep, occasionally interjecting with accusations of my cruelty and lack of maternal feeling. David simply looked furious, his calculations clearly not adding up to a sum he found acceptable. Finally, after nearly another hour of their recriminations and my steadfast, quiet responses, Michael threw his hands up in disgust. "Fine," he spat. "Have it your way, Mother. But don't expect us to come running when you need something. You've made your bed. Now you can lie in it." He stormed out of the house, slamming the front door so hard that one of my porcelain birds on the mantelpiece wobbled precariously. Sarah, tears still streaming, gave me one last look of anguished accusation. "I can't believe you've done this to your own family," she whispered, before turning and following her brother, David trailing silently but angrily behind her. The door slammed again. And then silence. A profound, echoing silence filled the house. I sat there for a long time, the teacups cold, the biscuits untouched. The anger and adrenaline slowly drained away, leaving behind a strange mixture of emotions. There was sadness, a deep, aching grief for the relationships that were now irrevocably broken, for the children I had loved who had revealed themselves to be strangers driven by entitlement. But underneath the sadness, there was also an immense, overwhelming sense of relief. A weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying had been lifted. The constant tension, the oppressive atmosphere of their expectations, the draining charade of their feigned concern, it was all gone. The house, my home, suddenly felt lighter, cleaner. It was mine again, truly mine, no longer a battleground for their greed. I walked over to the mantelpiece and gently straightened the porcelain bird. It was a small, delicate thing, a symbol of beauty and fragility, much like the trust one had once placed in my children. That trust was shattered now, but I, unlike the bird, had not wobbled. I had stood firm. And in doing so, I had reclaimed not just my assets, but my dignity, my peace, and my right to define my own legacy. The storm had passed, and in its wake, there was a quiet, if somewhat melancholy, calm. In the days and weeks that followed the family meeting, the silence from Michael and Sarah was absolute. There were no more calls, no more visits, No more feigned concern. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The tap of their attention, which had flowed so freely when they believed there was something to gain, had been abruptly turned off. Initially, a part of me, the maternal part that had loved them unconditionally for so many decades, felt a pang of loss. But this was quickly overshadowed by an enormous sense of liberation. The oppressive weight of their expectations was gone. My home was once again a sanctuary, not a future asset to be picked over. I could breathe again. Ms. Albright handled a few blustering letters from a lawyer Michael had evidently consulted, but as she had predicted, they were all bark and no bite. The legal arrangements were unassailable. My competency was not in question. Their attempts to challenge my decisions were futile, and after a short, expensive flurry of legal posturing on their part, it all went quiet on that front too. The house seemed to sigh with relief alongside me. I wandered its rooms, no longer feeling like a curator of a museum awaiting its inheritors, but as its rightful, peaceful occupant. I started spending more time in the garden, a passion I'd shared with Robert. The roses bloomed with a particular vibrancy that spring, or perhaps I simply had more time and peace of mind to appreciate them. I reread Robert's favorite books, his presence feeling closer and more comforting now that the static of my children's greed had been silenced. Letters began to arrive from the charities. Heartfelt letters of gratitude from the Scholarship Fund, detailing how the initial endowment would help several students attend university that autumn. A lovely, handwritten note from the director of the Willow Creek Animal Sanctuary, along with photographs of the site where the new veterinary clinic would be built, explaining how my contribution would make a tangible difference to the lives of countless animals. The Institute for Neurological Research sent a formal acknowledgement and later, an invitation to a small reception for benefactors. These communications were a balm to my soul. They affirmed my decision, validated the path I had chosen. My life's work with Robert wasn't going to be squandered or fought over. It was going to make a difference, however small, in the wider world. It was going to foster education, heal animals, support vital research. This was a legacy Robert would have been truly proud of. I even decided to volunteer one morning a week at the animal sanctuary. It was only a couple of hours, helping to socialize kittens or fold laundry, but it connected me to the tangible results of my decision. The purring of a rescued cat, the grateful nuzzle of a dog awaiting adoption. These small moments brought a quiet joy, a sense of purpose that had been missing. Occasionally, I would think of Michael and Sarah. I wondered if their shared disappointment had brought them closer or driven them further apart, their previous arguments over an inheritance that never materialized for them now a bitter, shared memory. I felt a pang of sadness for them, not for their loss of potential wealth, but for their loss of something far more valuable: integrity, empathy, and a genuine connection to their mother. They had traded familial love for the illusion of financial gain, and in the end, they had neither. My friend Margaret was a constant source of support. "You look 10 years younger, Eleanor," she remarked one afternoon over tea. "There's a piece about you I haven't seen in ages," she was right. The resolution of the conflict, the decisive action I had taken, had brought with it a profound sense of inner peace. It wasn't a triumphant, gloating peace, but a quiet, settled contentment. I had faced a painful truth about my children, and instead of letting it destroy me, I had used it to redefine my life and my legacy on my own terms. My dignity was restored, not by their apology or contrition, which I knew would never come, but by my own actions. I had underestimated my own strength for a long time, just as they had. But no more. I was Eleanor Sterling, a woman who knew her own mind, who had honored her husband's memory in the best way she knew how, and who is now living her remaining years with a sense of purpose, freedom, and quiet satisfaction. The path to this peace had been painful, fraught with betrayal and disappointment, but the destination was worth every difficult step. My children were left to deal with the consequences of their greed, their relationship with each other likely forever tainted by the bitterness of what they perceived as a shared loss. As for me, I had found a new beginning in what they had assumed was my end. And that, I realized, was the sweetest vindication of all. The echoes of their anger faded, replaced by the gentle hum of a life lived authentically, on my own terms, surrounded by the memories I cherished and the promise of a future where my legacy would bloom in unexpected, beautiful ways.